record, starting that up. So yeah, okay, we're all good and we're all live. Okay, so a bit of backstory behind the webinar that myself and Mina are running this evening is that over the years of working with a lot of climbers from lots of different backgrounds, we've noticed a little bit of a common theme that we have a number of clients or ex-clients who have not just got an interest in climbing. They do a number of other activities outside their climbing, whether that's running, cycling, swimming, another sport, or they have something which is quite heavy in terms of the impact that it might have on their energy levels or nutrition in their life. So that could be a really hard physical labor job, or they might have a very, very high daily kind of activity level throughout the day, and that impacts back into their climbing. And myself and Mina and others in the team have certainly noticed some interesting habits and patterns around this nutritional element. And I, until a couple of years ago, wasn't entirely convinced how big an effect this was on climbing, training, recovery, etc., until I started to do another sport and really go quite hard at it and do a fair bit, and then saw the impact that it had back on my climbing. And it really, really kind of shocked me. Myself and Mina had quite a few chats about this. And I suddenly realized when I tried to combine something and I knew where my baseline was, and I wasn't addressing my nutrition properly with that, I was really set back a long way on my performance, doing the sports, and then also the training, the recovery from it. So that's a little bit of context for all of you out there. And I suspect that a number of you are also doing other sports and other hobbies. So we're going to try and kind of guide you through a little bit of this and give you some context for how you might address this. And Mina, also, you have a certain background within climbing and nutrition and a sort of personal interests in this sort of stuff. So can you give everyone listening and watching a little bit of background to your interests within nutrition?
Yeah, sure. So I've been kind of studying nutrition for the past few years. I would still class myself as being like relatively new. I haven't been doing this for kind of 10 years plus, like some nutritional professionals have. The thing I really like about looking at nutrition in climbing is, partly I love climbing, right? I've been climbing for over 25 years, which makes me feel really old to say that. I started really young. But I think one of the things I really like about looking at nutrition within climbing is that sports nutrition is super interesting, like on its own, but a lot of the research we have is in more popular mainstream sports. So like running, cycling, swimming, things like that. And often slightly more kind of linear sports, like climbing, so multifaceted. And so taking a lot of that research and then you have to be in some ways a bit creative and think outside the box, think, okay, how does this apply to climbing, and what are the energy demands, and where are they similar and where are they different, and how can we take this information that we have that's fairly established and make it work for climbing. And it's amazing the variety that you get of things that work for some people don't seem to work for other people's, and like lots of new ideas and things coming through. What we really need is more direct research into climbing, which is starting to happen, but slowly.
Oh, thanks, Mina. I totally agree. There's a lot further to go, and in any area of sports science, we are constantly asking for more information and more knowledge, and still there's no perfect system and no perfect answer to a lot of big questions. So we have to kind of feel our way around it as best as possible through both experience and academic knowledge, isn't it? It's that blend between the two.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Okay, so first kind of, I suppose, main topic, which we'll then get some Q&A from everyone listening on, is that if we're to take, a key part here about managing both climbing and other hobbies, other sports, other parts of our life, is how do I look at this whole thing of, am I eating enough? Because I had this question a lot over the last 2 years. What am I looking at in this area?
Sure. And to give people a bit of context, when Tom said he was doing another sport, he was like ultra running. So in terms of the intensity and the duration of what he was doing on top of his climbing, and work life and family life, it was pretty huge. So the energy demand suddenly went up, and I think a lot of what you experienced was just not really meeting that demand with increased food intake, or maybe you increased it a bit, but it's quite hard to keep up with those kinds of energy expenditures that, you know, if you're out running for kind of 6 or 7 hours. So yeah, are you eating enough? And it's so hard, because obviously it can be super individual. It depends on your you know, your height, your weight, your metabolism, all those kinds of things. So I can't give anyone like specific recommendations, but the key things you want to be looking at are your energy levels within sessions, whether that's another sport, whether that's in climbing, just during the day as well. Like, are you suddenly feeling or gradually feeling more lethargic and low energy? Concentration, motivation, recovery, so you're feeling kind of ready to go again, like as you would normally. Things like sleep, often sleep problems crop up when people are kind of maybe not fueling enough, but also just not managing to keep up with the demands of what they're putting their body through. And I mean, things like body weight and anthropometrics as well can change. So you do see, obviously, if your weight's dropping kind of fast and you've introduced this new stimulus, then you might want to think, oh, maybe I should be eating more. And that's kind of, I guess, one of the more obvious ones. But all those other cues are super important to watch out for as well. And it's difficult because I guess in this kind of scenario, there's this, you know, age-old question of, am I overtraining, or am I doing too much, or am I not eating enough? And you can, I guess, experiment in either direction. You can dial it down a little bit, see if you feel better. You can dial up the food a bit and see if you feel better.
Yeah, I'd say that one things that I found worked really well from a practical sense of this was that I found it very, very hard to work out, because I've been a climber for so long and I knew what more or less my nutritional demands were for climbing and where I could go too far on, you know, either end of it. But once I added in something else, I just felt so lost with it that really the way I started to find where my limits were to do almost experimental training days where I would deliberately go under and find out how I felt and what that would feel like. What was my body's response to going under, and then going way over what I thought, and then seeing what my body response was. And it was through that process of going way under and going, oh my goodness, my performance is so low. All I could ever do was tap into the low end, just very long endurance stuff, and then eating a lot more than I thought was even realistic or even almost healthy. And I found myself feeling incredible. And it was that bit that really kind of kicked me into, actually, you have to eat a lot more than you think you need to if you're doing a lot. I was really surprised at how far I had to go beyond what my gut sense was. I thought I had to go to 3,000, 3,500, but actually I was going up to more like 5,000 calories. And
wow.
That was where I was doing actually really well.
I mean, often with things like ultra running or big mountain days or multiple day events, people are really looking at, you know, loading up in the days before, fueling as well as you can on those days, and then real recovery fueling days afterwards when you look at those kinds of organized sport, because it's actually quite unrealistic sometimes to hit the kind of energy requirements that you might need for extremely big days. And I think often people get this sense of like, you know, we think of energy requirements and we see all the government guidelines, or, you know, it's this many calories a day to maintain health. And we think, oh, well, if that's where the number is. And if I go below that, I'm under fueling and I'll lose weight. And if I go above that, I'm over fueling and I'll suddenly gain weight. And actually, it's not an exact number, and we can't really work in exact numbers because everything's an estimate. You know, we're estimating energy expenditure, we're estimating energy intake. You know, even if you're using a database or an app for food types, there's huge margins of error on all of those things. So we're really looking at a range, and even within that range. So, for example, if you start to eat less, you might not, at the same energy expenditure, you might not start to lose weight straight away or you might lose weight straight away, but then it might plateau because your body will start to downregulate certain things. And we talk about non-exercise activity thermogenesis, which is essentially like movement that wouldn't be classed as exercise. So actually things like facial expressions come under that category, and, you know, moving around your house and motivation to do things. So, you know, you forget something up a flight of stairs, your motivation to go and get that thing might be lower if you're just generally slightly downregulated. But then equally, the other side of that middle ground, you could eat more and actually things get upregulated. So you wouldn't necessarily immediately start to gain body mass. If you go over that amount, you would start to upregulate. You actually start to burn more fuel. You might be more active. You might be more motivated. You might have longer, harder sessions as things kind of just have that support. So it's really quite a range. And I think that often gets missed. We like to think in these kind of linear set points.
Yeah. I think it's also interesting on that long-term versus short-term balance. So, for example, I always, and I see this also with clients that I, have a more sort of like closer relationship with, is that people don't often key in to the difference between short-term overfueling and underfueling and then the long-term thing. Because actually, when I was trying to play around with this, what I was often doing was I was short-term underfueling. So I was performing very poorly in a training session, but then I was so far overeating after the session because I was so annihilated from it that I was actually overall putting weight on. So it gave the appearance that actually I was consuming too much. And really it was just that I was periodizing and segmenting my energy intake really inappropriately. I was just not doing it right.
And often you will see those, and I see that pattern when I analyze people's food diaries often, that they'll underfuel around their exercise session, their climbing session or whatever it is. And then they'll, for want of a better word, like overfuel later on, or essentially kind of overcompensate because their body's like, give me some fuel. And really that just means you're not getting you're still getting the overall in the same amount, say in a day, but you're not getting it where you can really make the most of it and kind of fuel your session with it. And I would say that example of you gaining weight in a kind of overall balance is, it's one of the, it ends up being a bit complicated, but you can get kind of down regulated to the point where you end up in energy balance, but low energy availability. I mean, I don't know if we want to go into that kind of depth on here, but it's quite interesting.
Yeah. Well, let's dive into some questions and see what we've got from everyone. There's a good one here actually. So if the aim is to increase your calorie or food intake, are there any tips to get it in throughout the day when you feel full all the time? And I think, we've both heard this issue a number of times. What's a good strategy to deal with this? The kind of whole just feeling stuffed too much.
Sure. So it's an interesting one because I'm a big believer in like listening to your hunger and fullness signals as well. And, not wanting to necessarily, just as we wouldn't override and ignore hunger, not necessarily to override and ignore fullness, because I think your body is really dynamic and good at telling you when and where you need fuel. Having said that, there are certain foods that can make you feel more or less full for different amounts of energy intake, if that makes sense. So we're talking about the calorie density essentially of foods. So imagine if you eat like a big portion of salad that's got loads of like cabbage and, cruciferous veg and, quite high fiber volume food, you're going to feel quite full probably after eating a big bowl of that kind of thing, but it doesn't actually confer you that many calories. If you were to eat something denser, like take like a flapjack or something, or an energy bar, things like that can be quite energy dense. Oh, so they've got a higher calorie value, but actually they don't make you feel that full. So it's finding where you need to be with those foods. And obviously you don't want to just eat flapjacks and never eat your salads, but it's a balance, so if you're in the habit of eating a lot of kind of roughage, that can often make you feel more full. So it's around those sessions. So if you're doing big climbing sessions, big days out or big runs, things like that, you want to actually be thinking about faster acting, lower volume, higher calorie density foods.
So what you're saying is that my chocolate caterpillar cake was a great strategy. Is that right?
I'm not sure I'd quite go that far. We should have recorded some of those conversations.
I know, yeah. People will be appalled to know what I was doing. Okay, another sort of question, I suppose, in related to this in some ways as well, and another one that I know that you have talked to, you know, us as a team about, and you put some stuff out on social media as well, is what are your thoughts about, you know, quite objective calorie counting versus intuitive eating? How do you feel about this whole thing?
Yeah, it's really difficult, and I personally think it's an area where they can meet and find a bit of balance in the middle, because, you know, sports nutrition does require a certain amount of number crunching. It doesn't necessarily need to be that person that does the number crunching. A nutritionist can do it for you, but a lot of people feel quite empowered to understand, okay, why am I eating this much? How much do I need to eat? And often it can be helpful to know the density of foods and the carbohydrate content of foods, so that you know that you're giving your body enough, and especially in weight sensitive sports as well, so that you're kind of treading that line essentially and keeping healthy and performing well. And, you know, we have a lot of research to say, you know, X amount of carbohydrates is good for this kind of range of sports and energy demands of this duration. And so, you know, it would seem a shame not to use all of that. But equally, I think we can, in some sports and communities, get really kind of disengaged from our bodies as well, and make everything quite cognitive. And, you know, we stick to the numbers, but we ignore the fact that actually maybe you're full or maybe you're hungry. And intuitive eating is, I mean, we could do a whole webinar on it. It's a really interesting framework, and I think it's really, really valuable. Its predominant sphere isn't sports nutrition, but there is a space for, I think, for it to come in and to work alongside it. So it's that, I guess, being informed by nutritional understanding, being informed by energy requirements, macronutrient requirements, and energy expenditures, and knowing what you need to do to support your body in the sport that you're doing, but not disengaging with your internal signals and cues, and really working to make sure that you're still getting satisfaction out of food, that your food relationship is still good. And yeah, because there's a few things, for example, like heavy exercise can, in a lot of people, suppress appetite. So, you know, you might not feel hungry, but you probably do need to eat after a 5-hour run or whatever it is you're doing, Tom. But I know that kind of, like, I did a bit of trail running for a while, and I used to get back from these runs and just not feel hungry. But sports nutrition says, you know, I should be refueling after that. And actually, intuitive eating says the same thing, because it's an element of self-care, and that's where they kind of intersect.
Do you think it's similar to how we often look at training, that we can be quite systematic and numbers based with training, and saying, I'm doing this many sessions of this, and this is how I'm laying out as a very structured way of our training. But with time, and the more that we do that, we learn a more intuitive way of, one, listening to our bodies. So we all, almost with time, when we get really expert at this, have to structure less. And two is that even if something says, do 2 strength sessions today, 1 in the morning and 1 in the evening, if you're just not feeling it, in your gut sense, like your body is telling you, don't do the strength training session, don't just follow it blindly just because it says it in your spreadsheet. If it doesn't feel right, don't do it. Do you think it's similar with this, with the, you know, eating and nutrition?
Yeah, definitely. And I think at Lattice, we talk a lot about kind of allostatic load in the context of training. And I think that's really relevant in a way for nutrition as well, because, you know, training doesn't happen in a vacuum, and neither does nutrition, right? So our bodies are really dynamic, but there's also loads of different inputs. So yes, you're doing your training program or whatever, but that's not the only thing you're doing with your life. And that's partly what this whole webinar is about, right? You might also be running, or maybe you don't do another sport, but you walk to work, or you cycle to work, or you run around after a toddler. And so there's loads of other things that are going to be affecting your energy levels, maybe just stress at work, or lack of sleep, or, you know, all sorts of things. So there's lots of things that will affect how you might feel when you come to do your fingerboard session or whatever it is. And you need to be in touch with all of those things to know whether it's appropriate for you to follow through on that session or not. And it's kind of the same with nutrition, because, like I said before, everything's estimates. You know, we're estimating energy intake, we're estimating expenditure, and it's very hard to account for everything. Even if we, you know, do all the calculations based on your height, your body weight, your physical activity level, you know, your job, we have all these kind of daily activity level multipliers that we can use. And, you know, we can even start to use the kind of metabolic equivalent values and things to try and work out what your energy expenditure is with exercise. It's still all educated guesses, really. And so there's got to be room for that. Do you know what? I thought I needed to eat this much, but I'm still hungry. So I'm going to have some more food. Or, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I couldn't agree more, really, that the more I actually listened to how my body felt when I was mixing up more things and not just doing climbing, the better I did. And it was almost like my number one lesson that I learned was have food and water or some sort of hydration available at all times, everywhere in my whole life. Like I used to be like, it would only be available in the home or, wherever it might be. But when I realized that my demands were a lot higher, I got into basically the habit that it was available on tap 24 hours a day. And I would just have it whenever it felt right.
And it might be when you have energy expenditures as high as yours were when you were doing all that running, that it actually makes more sense to drip feed your system a bit more, because actually eating big volumes of food can be quite stressful on the digestive system. And you might, just kind of yo-yo a bit between like, oh, I'm really, really full, and oh, I need to eat again. And actually just having constant supply of things around those days at least.
Another question that I can see from a few people here actually is, and I think we're both seeing it becoming increasingly popular, and we're seeing more people take this choice with their diets, is around the vegan diet and how people address the energy balance and getting enough calories in. So we're not going to, I think maybe for this, the purpose of this webinar is maybe we'll stay a little bit broader and not go down the whole macros route and how we split all that up. But I think what is coming across quite a lot is just the general energy intake that's coming from those vegan diets when people make a sudden transition into it.
Yeah, sure. And the first thing that comes to mind for me is that when you switch onto a predominantly plant-based diet, that can often end up with a lot more fruit and veg and legumes and whole grains and things like that, which is obviously brilliant for your health in a lot of ways. But it does also mean you can end up taking in fewer calories for the same volume of food at certain meals. So it's just being mindful of that and knowing that if your plate is often full of predominantly higher volume, lower calorie density foods, you may need to consider eating a little bit more often. So not necessarily changing that meal, but saying, well, I used to eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Now I have a snack in the morning and a snack in the afternoon as well. And that helps me keep my overall energy intake up. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No. I think we're probably going to have to keep going over that topic again and again as we see this changeover, because we see it a lot in comments on any of the nutrition stuff that we put out on Lattice, and like I've had it even with a couple of my own clients that I've been working with who have transferred into a vegan diet over the years that I've been climbing, whereas I've never seen, in fact, I'm going to say I've never seen anyone go the other way, move from vegan back to a non-plant-based diet. So no, it's interesting.
And there's a lot of positives about moving on to a plant-based diet. I mean, there's obviously lots of positives outside of the nutrition sphere, but even when we're talking about nutrition, there's lots of really good carbohydrate sources that are completely vegan. So you're not really excluding that many foods that's going to be really kind of harmful. I guess it's more that it can be slightly more nuanced in some areas of nutrition, just to make sure you're getting a bit of everything. There's a few micronutrients that you just maybe have to be a bit more organized or work a little bit harder to ensure you're getting enough of. And things like, protein is just a little bit more nuanced to get enough if you're doing a lot of, especially like strength and power work or something like that. But it's all totally doable. It tends to be quite polarized. I think nutrition in general tends to be quite polarized, right? And I think there's a lot of room for us to be in the middle ground and to say, yeah, that can work and that can work. We just have to, you just have to tweak things a little bit.
Yeah. Okay, so one last question before we go on to talk about general activity levels and how we deal with those, either our sports, hobbies, or lifestyle. And that is a question around how we feel about the term cheat day. this particular phrase drives me mad. And it's mainly because I just don't see this as being, it feels like a non, it doesn't make sense to me at all, this phrase. Since when did, eating ever become cheating? I don't know, what are your thoughts on this, Mina?
Yeah, it makes me kind of sad, to be honest, because, when we say cheating, it implies that in the other sphere of our lives, there's rules and rigidity and potentially moralizing certain foods. And this is where the intuitive eating model is actually really strong on this stuff. And it's, I'm a big believer in, we shouldn't moralize foods. Yes, some foods will have a higher nutritional density than other foods, but that doesn't mean that those other foods don't have value. And food is much more than just nutrition. It's culture, it's connection, it's enjoyment, it's satisfaction, it's taste. And I think we have to look at it in this wider way. And yes, we're talking about performance here, but I think there has to be a balance of a kind of 80-20, enjoy the foods you like, but also enjoy eating foods that make you feel and perform well. But cheat days, I feel, brings in this kind of, I'm going to be really strict and rigid with food rules, which I don't think is a sustainable behavior. And I don't think it's a particularly healthy mental health behavior. To then have this, splurge kind of day off, your rules where you kind of eat whatever. It's this kind of restriction, kind of, I guess, binge mentality. And I think if we're just a bit more open to, eating in a wider sense, what we enjoy and what feels good in our bodies, and being more in touch with our hunger and fullness signals, and a bit more balanced, then you probably won't find you need those days, because you allow yourself to have the things that you enjoy at other times. And it doesn't always need to be nutritionally perfect. I mean, I work in the nutrition sphere. My meals aren't all nutritionally perfect. Some of them are really good, and some of them are, bang on what you would want to have nutritionally before a climbing session. And sometimes I just eat what I would really like to eat that day.
Yeah, no, and it's the same with what I see with most of the athletes or clients I've worked with over the years, and just even in the climbing fraternity locally with where we are, is that those that seem to be less formulaic, less rigid, this mentality around cheat days, things like that, seem to be a lot less problem free around their eating habits, their body weight, performance. And those that are much more rigid, have unusual rules, habits, behaviors, can often find themselves in holes that take them a while to dig out of. And it's just that because we are in a weight bearing sport, and there's a high impact on that difference in power to weight ratio, because it can often mask it, and the performance benefits that you can sometimes see in the short term can confuse this whole factor. So it's why it's a whole hole, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, right, let's talk about activity levels. And I know you I guess you were kind of touched a little bit before about where you talked about NEAT values, didn't you?
Yeah, so I guess, for example, if I was working with someone and trying to work out how much energy intake they needed for their expenditure, for their lifestyle and their sports, etc., one of the first things we would do is work out their basal metabolic rate. So that's using, height, weight, age, things like that. We have a variety of different equations actually that are better depending on what information you have, if you have lean body mass or if you just have weight. So there's various different ways you can do that, but you essentially end up with a number that represents an estimate of what you would burn energy-wise at rest. So that's if you are essentially, sleeping. So and so we have that as like our starting point, and that will vary depending on how tall, heavy, etc. you are, and how much lean mass you have. And then from there, we'll usually then look at that person's kind of occupational and physical activity. So day to day, most of the time, are they sat at a desk? Are they on their feet all the time? Are we looking at the expenditure of a postman, a nurse, someone that's really on their feet a lot of the time, or someone that's sitting in an office most of the day? Or are they a labourer, in which case it's going to be much higher? So one of the most traditional sports nutrition ways to use to calculate that is using physical activity multipliers. So we'd essentially multiply that BMR in order to get a value that represents that additional activity. And then we look at putting kind of exercise expenditure on top of that, which again is another layer of estimates. So you can see how when I say when we end up at an overall energy expenditure, it's very much an estimate. It's but then we look at the range around of that. And then it comes down to working with the individual to trial and error around that range, see what makes them feel good, see what makes them feel better, hopefully, and kind of play with it from there. So it's all about finding that starting point.
And so how would it work? Like, let's say for me is I'm a like, I feel like if you put me in a scenario and said, right, I'm going to get you working in the trees all day long, working on ropes and everything like that, I feel like I could work out, you know, my baseline energy or my additional energy expenditure on a really active day, because it feels and it looks similar to going out, almost like cragging for the day. But how would I, in practical sense, how would I deal with this if, let's say, I'm a parent who has a part-time job, but then I'm kind of like rushing around quite a lot. You know, I've got a really hectic, very busy lifestyle around the house. I'm, you know, loading washing machines, putting stuff out to dry, sorting out the kids. I'm in and out on some errands. I'm just generally running around like a maniac for 12 hours of the day. But at the end of the day, I'm thinking about then doing some training once the kids have gone to bed. How do I mean, I guess there's no tables for what's a parent of a 2-year-old do, you know?
Yeah, I mean, what we have generally are some vague classifications for, you know, sedentary, moderately active, or slightly active, moderately active, very active, and then examples of what those jobs might be. So like when we look at climbing and nutrition, we're often looking at research in other sports and extrapolating that and saying, how does that fit with what we're doing physically here? Again, you could do that and look at those classifications, go, I wonder, where am I fitting in there? Okay, I think it's kind of around this, you know, light to moderate, depending on your scenario, or heavy, and then, you know, you start your trial and error there.
Okay, yeah. So it's essentially you've just got to experiment and play around with it, and you're not going to get some, you know, defined value from it.
No, I know. It's funny, when I first started studying nutrition, I'm quite like a logical person. I quite like to have defined answers. And that's one of the things I found quite frustrating and I've had to get used to. And I often feel bad with people that can't give, you know, often the answer with nutrition is it depends. And it's going to be an estimate, and then we're going to have to play with it from there.
Well, I would think that's actually really useful for most people to know, that when they speak to someone who specializes in an area and that person can come back and go, it depends, or there's a lot of factors that come into play this, at least people are armed with that information. It's like the same thing when someone comes to me and they go to me, what's the best way to fingerboard? And I know lots about this, and I'll go, it depends. You know, there's so many factors in it, but it's useful to actually understand that there is no, you know, set answer on these things. There's no golden rule or secret or, you know, any of these things. There's multiple inputs that go into it.
Yeah, and we have guidelines, and we have, you know, directed research and recommendations based on those things. So we have structure to work within, just like you would for fingerboarding or kind of physical training. You have those kind of structures, and so that's, you have these starting points, but then it's very much, you know, the individual and how they fit into that, and their history and where they are at the moment and where they want to go.
Yeah. Okay. So to build on from that, got a good question here in the Q&A from everyone. I've got a question here about asking about the moderation of sort of nutrition and eating or fueling in the rest weeks off their heavy weeks. Is this the kind of scenario where we say you have a general activity level, broadly speaking, on your 3 hard training weeks, and then you have a generalized activity level on your rest week? How do we moderate and change that as, you know, humans in this ever-changing training plan, training sphere?
Sure. So the simplest answer is your body will probably tell you. You'll probably find that when you're on a deload week and your overall expenditure has gone down, you're not doing as much, you probably will find that you're not quite as hungry and ravenous as the days when you're doing a lot of exercise and training. So that's the kind of simple answer. Your energy expenditure will be lower. And I'm pausing because, it depends how long and how much of a deload you're having, right? Because, for example, a lot of people say, well, then on my rest days, should I be eating, on a heavy week, say on my rest day, should I be eating much less? But if you're, say, having one rest day in between two heavy training days, yes, your energy expenditure is lower on that day, but it's also a recovery and a refueling day. So it's important not to immediately drop intake when overall, when we zoom out, you're actually doing a lot over a period of time. And it's kind of the same with deload weeks. But yeah, so your energy expenditure will be lower is the kind of the main point. So you probably will find that you don't need quite as much fuel, but remember that you're recovering from however long that block of training was, and you're fueling up for the next one. The last thing you want to do is go into your next training phase undernourished.
Yeah. Okay. And is there anything that people should look at, particularly in terms of macros on those rest weeks versus heavy training weeks? Should we be making big alterations in stuff like protein intake across those 2 weeks? Is there a big change that we look at, or is it actually quite subtle?
So the main things that you would potentially do differently is carbohydrate intake. So carbohydrate is going to be our main fuel source for higher intensity exercise, and main fuel source for the brain as well. So that's the macronutrient that will go up when you're doing more training and more exercise. Depends a little bit on the intensity and duration of exercise. There are areas where you would periodize carbohydrate intake to be lower for some types. Again, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but in general speaking, yeah, the more we're doing, and especially with things like climbing, it's a high intensity sport. We're looking at making sure there's enough available glycogen in the muscles for the sessions that you're undergoing. So in the flip from that, if you're having a deload week, you're exercising less, you might want to take some of that energy expenditure out from your carbohydrate intake. And you could enjoy meals that have a different balance as well. It's quite nice in a way, periodizing a little bit, because you can then have meals that look a bit different. It allows for a bit of food variety and meal variety. Yeah,
that's what I do on my rest weeks. There's certain things that I really like eating, but they make me feel so slow and sluggish, but I love them. So for example, I absolutely love steak.
Yeah,
I cannot have steak on training days because I feel like I want to sleep. Well, I'll just not do anything for quite a few hours afterwards. And I'm not really a heavy evening eater. I'd rather eat a little bit earlier in the day in terms of my main energy intake. So I can do that on my rest weeks. I can go and have things like that and really enjoy them. And it doesn't affect really anything for me because I get to enjoy the food, but I haven't got to then go and do loads of training that day. So it's win-win really.
cool.
Okay, another good question. Actually, interesting one here. What do you see as being the potential negative effects that a highly active person will face with a lack of sleep or poor nutrition? Are we going to generally see a sort of, I guess, we all know that it's going to be across the board effect in terms of both training and recovery. But do you think there's particular acute noticeable effects we might see in terms of recovery or the training performance?
Yeah, so I'll answer the kind of nutrition side of that. I think sleep is for sure not going to be bad sleep is not going to be great for performance, for training and recovery. And sometimes things can get kind of muddled because overtraining can affect your sleep, underfueling can affect your sleep. So often, they're not necessarily going to be in isolation or isolated issues. With nutrition, yeah, for sure. Was it in the question, was it longer term effects or shorter term effects?
It didn't say actually.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, if you're wondering if in terms of symptoms for underfueling, if we're talking in a chronic sense, then we're looking at kind of lower energy availability. So it's that down regulation of certain processes in the body that will be affected, because essentially your body will always prioritize movement. So it will fuel the run that you're going for, it will fuel the climbing or the training that you're doing, and it will basically start to suppress other things. So you might find often sleep can be disrupted. You might find you get cold more easily. You might find motivation and concentration aren't as good, general lethargy. Then, obviously this is a sliding scale, and it can get worse and worse. And then we're moving into the kind of low energy availability, relative energy deficiency kind of sphere, where you start to see like hormone downregulation and things like that, which then we're getting into kind of more serious ground there. But yeah, so you might see, energy levels drop off, recovery just not quite coming. And when we get into that hormone dysregulation, then often training will start to suffer. So you might struggle to see as many gains in your training and things like that, because you're not producing enough of kind of anabolic hormones.
Okay.
It's like housekeeping. General housekeeping gets laid off because you're paying for the exercise with the amount of food that you're putting in. Is that a good analogy?
I quite like that. Yeah, that's good, that. What are your thoughts on spreading the calories or food that we have in through the day? But I suppose we'll tackle it specifically on calories, so actual energy rather than volume or quantity of food. What are your thoughts on spreading the calories throughout the day completely evenly, so going third, or do you think they should be chunked or periodized a little bit more? How do you normally look at that with athletes?
Again, it depends what they're doing. So if you have someone who's training predominantly in the morning, I would say that breakfast is going to be a super important meal. Obviously, you want to leave a bit of time for digestion. You really want to make sure that they're fueling up well for that session. Then you'd have some training food during a session if it's a long session, and then really making sure they refuel afterwards. And then later in the day, they would obviously eat again at various points, but it would maybe be more front loaded to when they're training. Equally, on the flip side, if they're training more in the evening, I would still spread through the day, because all those kind of feeds, if you like, from morning through to the training in the evening are topping up glycogen stores and making available energy for that session later on. Again, it depends on the intensity and duration of those sessions as to how much and where exactly you'd place that. But yeah, it can definitely look a bit different depending on how the exercise is spread throughout the day.
And is there an approach and a strategy that you can take with this, that if let's say you're an early morning trainer, and you're getting up at 7 a.m. and you actually tend to train between, let's say, 8 a.m. and 9:30 a.m. Is there a sort of strategy and method you can take whereby you can effectively do part of your fueling or preparation the night before, so that you're sort of absorbing, taking things on during that sleep, and then you're properly ready for your next morning session? How's that going to work?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, when we're looking at kind of a main fuel for a training session, we're thinking about overall energy, but also carbohydrate intake. So if you're doing that kind of session in the morning, you want to think about making sure you're getting adequate carbohydrate and energy intake the night before, because actually overnight, most of what we deplete is liver glycogen, not muscle glycogen. So then you won't be fully glycogen depleted in your muscles. If you've had a good dose of carbs in the evening, you won't be fully glycogen depleted. So even if you were to do that training session fasted, you would still have some energy to be going on. I wouldn't necessarily recommend fasted training outside of, at least regularly. Like, it can be something that we do in a periodized fashion for specific benefits. But you could have a small top up, for example. If you really think, I don't have time to have a more adequate breakfast before this session, you could have, a glass of milk and a banana or something. It's going to go a long way to rehydrating you, giving you a bit of quickly available carbohydrate, topping things up essentially, and getting you a kind of good quality training session.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for that. That's it's something that I've been asked lots about clients, and I've also always wondered, because I historically I've done, especially with the bouldering stuff I do, I quite happily go into a morning, very high intensity bouldering session, relatively fasted, and I perform really well in that setting for bouldering. But if I do it for route climbing, I just don't do very well off it. So I think it's like the short, high intensity session, it works well for. Going long and hard, it never worked. It always had to be really good breakfast as well.
Well, you're probably just burning through your glycogen stores a lot like faster and through that session. I mean, we think of high intensity as, you know, when you're doing that bouldering session, you are using your anaerobic system, but you're also using your phosphocreatine system quite a bit in those short bouts of bouldering. So it'll vary, but yeah, I imagine you're just kind of draining the tank more.
Yeah. Okay, well, we're just about kind of getting towards the end of this webinar, and it's been pretty. I mean, we've had loads of questions going through here, so sorry that I can't get through and answer, or Mina can't get through and answer all of your questions, but they've all been really, really good questions from everyone, and I think they've been nice because they'll tackle in a broad sense for everyone watching and listening this evening. And can I get you to leave us all, Mina, with perhaps just a few thoughts on what would be your typical kind of like top of the wish list items that you wished more climbers who do lots of other activity on top of climbing, so whether that's other sports or just, you know, heavy labor-based jobs or very, very active days, what are the kind of key things that you would like them just to tick off the top of the checklist when they're looking at nutrition?
Okay, so like low-hanging fruit, you mean?
Yeah. Where would you send people first?
Okay, so I would say, have a look and think about how you feel, how you recover, how you perform. Are you eating enough? That's like such a pillar of nutrition. It seems almost too basic, but it's really, really important. And you can play with that. Experiment, like put in a few more calories each day and see if you just upregulate your performance and your training and how good you feel. And you know, you can always go back down if it doesn't make any difference. So I would say, yeah, are you eating enough? And then think about fueling adequately with carbohydrate around those kind of longer duration and higher intensity sessions, making sure that your muscles have got the glycogen that they need. And the third thing would be like the practical element of it. So like you said, making sure that you have food available when you need it, being organized so that, you know, it's one thing to know I'm going to need a snack or I'm going to need a recovery meal or something, but if it's not there and ready and you don't have access to it, it's not going to do you any good. So the organization, practical side.
Darn it, that whole organization thing always comes back to bite us all, doesn't it?
Yeah. Oh, and eat foods that you like.
Yeah.
that serve you well in lots of ways, but you like the taste of and you enjoy.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for that, Mina. It's been really good to, you know, chat through it with you, and yeah, thanks to everyone who has logged on this evening to join us for the live Q&A. All of you out there are really kind of what keep us going here, and you know, keep us motivated to keep doing this stuff and sharing the knowledge and support and expertise. And for any of you who are wondering more about the kind of the nutrition stuff and you want to dive a bit deeper into this, we have both nutrition reports and analysis packages that Mina offers, and they're entirely bespoke one-to-one nutritional services. And then also she runs people through nutrition training plans or plans as well, and those can also be structured to work within any of the climbing training that you're currently doing. So she'll look at what's going on with the climbing, and obviously we run training plans within Lattice anyway, so those two can tie really well together. So have a look on the website if you want to learn more about that. Come and have a look at Lattice 365. Mina's in there every week. We have our community pages on Facebook. We're all really active on there. More questions, you always know that we're on social media pretty much every day. And yeah, you know, thanks very much, and we will see you all again very soon. So I shall see you later on this week, Mina, and we'll chat soon.
Alrighty, bye.
Bye.